Okay. Today's daf is Nun Aleph. We are starting on the Mishnah on the top. Lo kisau mibod yom, lo yichasanu mishetech shach. So it says if they didn't cover the pot. So we're talking again about hatmana. So about insulating the pot. If they didn't do it before Shabbat started, you can't cover it once Shabbat starts. We learned that already. You can't insulate pots on Shabbat. Kisau v'nitgala, if you covered it up and it became uncovered, so then mutar lechasoto, you can recover it. So if you insulated, it's similar to the idea of if you left something over the blech, you left something over the fire and you remove it, you could return it under certain circumstances, under certain conditions. So in the same, but if you didn't leave it at all, you can't just put it on there for the first time on Shabbat. So in the same vein, if you left it insulated before Shabbat, that's okay. But if it becomes uncovered, you can recover it. But you can't cover it the first time on Shabbat. Similarly, you can fill water and you can put it under a pillow or under a mattress. Now, there's a machloket rishonim here about what this is talking about. So we're just going to go with Rashi, who says that the purpose of this insulation is to keep it cold, not to keep it hot. In other words, during the summertime, you want to keep your drink from getting warm, so you put it into a pillow, you put it into the mattress to keep it cool, to keep it out of the sun. Okay, that's how Rashi interprets it. Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda says, Amar Shmuel said, Mutar lahatmin et hatzonen. You're allowed to insulate cold things. Now here we have a machloket rishonim, very fundamental. Because according to Rashi, what lahatmin et hatzonen means, to refrigerate, so to speak, okay? In other words, to keep things cold. According to Rambam, lahatmin et hatzonen means something else. That you can insulate something that's already cold. Meaning all of the insulation that we've talked about so far has been hot items that you want to keep hot. So you wrap them in insulation. What happens if you have a cold item and you just want to warm it a little bit by wrapping it in some warm blankets to take the chill off, to warm it up a little bit? So that Rambam says that's what this is talking about. Lahatmin et hatzonen means that if the thing is already cold, we're not worried you're going to come to cook it by wrapping it in blankets to warm it up. It's okay. So the Shulchan Aruch actually brings both of these opinions as valid. And says they're both okay. Now, but moving on. So we're going to just assume Rashi's interpretation because it's easier to go with one interpretation. But keep in mind that the Rambam is interpreting this differently, that hatmana always means to keep something warm, and that what we're talking about here is keeping, in other words, something that's already cold, insulating it doesn't really have the same effect. So that's why it's allowed, according to the Rambam. According to Rashi, we're talking about trying to keep it cold. Okay, so Amar Rav Yosef says, what are you trying to tell us? Tanina, we already learned. We already learned in the Mishnah that you're allowed to take this bottle of water or this jug of water and put it into the pillow or put it into the mattress. And that's talking about a jug of water that's cold. So obviously you're allowed to insulate cold things, either like Rashi says, in order to keep them cold or in order to warm them up a little bit. Amar le Abai says, so why did Rav Yehuda have to tell us what Shmuel said? Why did Shmuel have to say this? It's in the Mishnah, so what's the chidush here? The answer is, de'imi matnitin hava amina hanimi ledavar she'en darkol hatmin, aval davar she'darkol hatmin lo kamashmalan. So the answer is that you might have thought that something that normally, our Mishnah is talking about something that it's not normal to insulate altogether. In other words, it's not normal to insulate it to keep it warm. You don't insulate water. Nobody takes water and tries to wrap it in blankets to keep it warm. That's not the usual way to do it. Normally, if they wanted to keep water hot, they would keep it over the fire on Shabbat. Okay, so he says, since it's something that you wouldn't normally come to insulate when it's hot, so you're allowed to insulate when it's cold. But something like let's say you had a kugel, I don't know, anything, some other food, cooked dish, and you wanted to insulate that when it was cold, either to keep it cold, Rashi says, or to warm it up a little bit, like Rambam says. Either way, maybe you would think it's not okay because you might confuse that with a situation where the item is hot and you're insulating it hot. So therefore we had to tell you that no, in all circumstances, if the item is cold, you can insulate it.
Question is, what do they call cold and what do they call hot?
Under Yad Soledetbo, for sure.
Oh, so Yad Soledetbo.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So that's for sure the definition. Now, Amar Rav Huna says, Asur latmin et hatzonen. I disagree. You're not allowed to insulate cold things. So.
The old days I know we used to take the water in summertime from the well to cool.
Yeah. How would you keep it cold?
We had made out of finish, and they had already a sheet around it made out of straw.
Uh-huh.
And it was already not an integral part, but you would like cover it out and put it in.
And it would keep it cool.
Yes, just to keep the water.
Right, that's what they're talking about here. Okay.
So anything that is not yet solid cold, they say it's cold.
It's called cold.
That's called cold. Okay.
Right. Now, according to Rashi, anyway, you're trying to insulate this to make it cooler. So you're trying to go down in temperature anyways. Now, Amar Rav Huna says, Asur latminit tatzonen. You're not allowed to insulate cold things. Vatanya, but we learned in the Braita Rabbi Hitir latminit tatzonen. Didn't Rabbi Yehuda Nasi say you're allowed? And what we're missing here is we're missing in the Girsa that we have. It should say Amar Rav Huna Amar Rabbi. That Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said you're not allowed to insulate cold things. And then there's a Braita that says that he said you could. So what does Rabbi hold? Does Rabbi Yehuda Nasi agree with our Mishnah that you're allowed to insulate cold things, or does he disagree? Lo kashya, it's not really a contradiction, because ha mikamei de lishmei mei de Rabbi Yishmael b'Rabbi Yosei, ha levatar de lishmei, because originally Rabbi had one position, and later on, when he heard the teaching of Rabbi Yishmael b'Rabbi Yosei, he changed his mind. How so? Ki had diativ Rabbi, because once upon a time Rabbi was giving the shiur. And he said you cannot insulate cold things. Now according to Rashi, again, this means to keep them cold. According to Rambam, it means to take the chill off, to warm it a little bit. Rabbi Yishmael b'Rabbi Yosei said, Abba hitir latminat tatzonen. My father, meaning Rabbi Yosei himself, allowed you to insulate cold things. Now his father was obviously older than Rabbi Yehuda Nasi himself. He was from the previous generation. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi honored, respected his father very much. So he said, Amar kevar horazaken. The elder has already ruled, meaning, I said that you're not allowed to insulate cold food, but now that I hear that my elder, Rabbi Yosei, said that you can, I retract. He deferred to what Rabbi Yishmael reported in the name of his father. Amar Rav Papa says, Bo ur'eh kama mechavavin ze et ze. Look how much the Chachamim loved each other. She'ilu Rabbi Yosei kayam haya kafuf yoshev lefnei Rabbi, because if Rabbi Yosei himself had been alive instead of his son, he too would have sat in front of Rabbi. In other words, he would have honored the office of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, was the head of everything. So he would have honored him. He would have sat in front of him as a student. Because even though Rabbi Yosei was a great leader of the Jewish people and his son was in his place, the son sat in front of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi as a student. Certainly the father would have done the same. And nonetheless, even though he knew that even his father, in other words, even Rabbi Yosei himself was no longer alive in the story, even he would have been kafuf. He would have subordinated himself to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and nonetheless Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had so much kavod for him that he deferred to his opinion. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the editor, right, of the Mishnah. So that's why he retracted his position. Amar le Rav Nachman le Daru Avdei. Rav Nachman said to his servant Daru, Atmin litzonen. On Shabbat he told him, please insulate something cold for me. Go take this water and keep it cold for me. And bring me some water that a non-Jewish chef heated up. In other words, that wasn't on Shabbat, obviously. Okay? One was on the weekday. One was on Shabbat. He told him, insulate something cold for me. And on the weekday, he said, bring me some coffee or whatever that was brewed by non-Jew, or bring me some water for tea that was cooked up by a non-Jewish guy. And these are two different issues. One issue is, can you insulate cold things? And the other issue is, bishul nochri, a non-Jew cooking for you. These are unrelated issues. So Sheba Rabbi Ami v'ikpad. Rabbi Ami didn't like this. He didn't like either of these things. He didn't like insulating cold things, and he didn't like that he had a non-Jew cooking for him. Because you're not normally supposed to do that. So Amar Rav Yosef said, "My ta'ama ikpid ki Rav v'vatei avid." Why are you upset, Rabbi Ami? He's just doing according to his teachers. Chada ki Rav v'chada ki Shmuel. One is like Rav, one is like Shmuel. Ki Shmuel da'amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel mutalat min tatzonen. Because he's following Shmuel, who said you're allowed to insulate cold things. And Kirav, the Amar Rav Shmuel, Amar Yitzchak, Amar Rav, and he's following Rav in one thing because Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel said that Rav said, Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said that Rav said, Kol shu nechal kemot shu chai, and bo b'shu bishulei nochri. Anything that could be eaten raw, we don't apply the rule of bishul akum. So that's why you can go into Starbucks and get a cup of coffee. That's why you can go into anything that, heating water is not a problem. A non-Jew can heat water for you, a non-Jew can cook vegetables, because the vegetables could be eaten raw. Vegetables that can't be eaten raw is another story. But definitely something that can be eaten raw, the non-Jew can cook for you. So why then was Rabbi Ami upset that Rav Nachman relied on the teachings of his teachers? Savar Adam Chashuv Shaneh. He thought an Adam Chashuv, such a respectable person as Rav Nachman, shouldn't rely on these lenient opinions. It looks bad. It looks bad because people will see that Rav Nachman is lenient a little bit and they'll go lenient more. So you should be more strict. But actually the halakha is brought in the Shulchan Aruch not like this. And it says even if you're an Adam Chashuv, it's allowed. Now we say, even though we say that you cannot insulate with anything once Shabbat starts, meaning not with something that adds heat, not with something that preserves heat. If you already had insulation on the pot, you can add a little bit to it. Ketzad will say, how so? Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer, notel et hasadinin, umaniach et haglof karin, or notel et haglof karin, umaniach et hasadinin. He says, if you already insulated with heavy coats that you put around the pot, you could switch it with sheets. If you had sheets, you could switch it with coats. In other words, if you insulated already, you could switch the material, even if the new material you're bringing it insulates better. Okay? It doesn't matter. And similarly did Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say, if, let's say you had a teapot, and the teapot is hot. This is the teapot that you actually had over the fire. And you took that teapot and you poured into another pot. You can insulate the second pot. Why? What's the reason? Because hashta kore kamakirla artoche kamirtachla. So the thing is that what's the reason why you can't insulate? Because we're worried you're going to come to heat something. Right? We're worried you're going to come to heat it. Now, if you've already taken the hot pot and poured it into another pot, you're clearly not that worried about heating it. Because you would have left it in the hot pot if you wanted to keep it piping hot. So the fact that you poured it into a second pot already is cooling it. So if you've already made peace with the idea, so to speak, of cooling it, so we're not worried that by insulating it you're going to come to heat it up again. Because you already removed it from the source that would have kept it hot. It's like if you pour water from your urn on Shabbat, you pour it into a cup. Insulating that cup is not a problem. You're not planning on that cup being piping hot. You know it's going to get cold. Okay, so that's what Rabbi. That's the halakha too. Taman v'kisa b'davar nital b'Shabbat, or taman b'davar she'no nital b'Shabbat. So he says, if you insulated and you covered the top of the pot with something that's not muktzeh, or you surrounded it with something that is muktzeh, but you covered the top with something that isn't muktzeh. So the point of both of these cases is, in both cases, we're not really worried about what's around the pot. We're worried about what's on top of the pot. So in both of these cases, what's on top of the pot is not muktzeh, so it's no problem. So there you have no problem. However, so in that case, you can take the top of the pot off and put it back, and you can put the insulation back on the top. Because the thing that's on top of the pot is not muktzeh anyway. But if you insulated around the sides with something that's muktzeh, and you covered it with something that's muktzeh, or even if what you insulated around the sides wasn't muktzeh, but what you put on top was muktzeh, so the main thing is the top is covered by something muktzeh. So we don't really care what's around. You might have thought, we go by the majority. Since the whole thing is covered with non-muktzeh, the top isn't a big deal. The answer is, if the top is covered with something muktzeh, now you have a problem. So it says, in that case,
because the top is very far.
Right, well, because that's what you're going to be taking off. Right? So if the top of the pot is revealed a little bit, so you can put your hand and you could take the top of the pot and then you put it back. and the stuff that's on top will fall back out onto it. V'im lav, and if not, meaning if there's no exposed part of the top of the pot, in other words, because you can't touch it, you're not going to be able to open the pot without handling the muktzeh then. So you can't cover it over with the muktzeh stuff to the point that you can't actually reach and touch the pot top and take the pot top off. If it's totally covered with muktzeh stuff, then you're going to have to directly handle the muktzeh in order to get to the top of the pot. That's not acceptable. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Neoret shel pishtan daka haru kazevel. This is just a tosefta, so not everything in here relates to our direct point. We actually learned this before. The Rabbi Yehuda said that the stuff that you comb out of flax, if it's very fine, it's considered something that adds heat and you can't use it. Merichin mecham al gabe mecham ukdera al gabe kedera. Aval lo kedera al gabe mecham umecham al gabe kedera. So here it says, in this version, you can take a hot pot of water and put it on top of another kettle of water. And you can put a hot pot on top of another hot pot. But you can't put a pot on top of the kettle of water or a kettle of water on top of a pot. Okay? Now that version is rejected by most of the Rishonim, the version that we have in our Gemara. And really it should say it doesn't matter. You can also put a pot on top of a hot water and you can put hot water on top of a pot. This is talking about on Shabbat itself. Both of them are hot. So we know that there are issues. You can't return something to an open flame on Shabbat ever. But let's say you had a hot pot and you want to keep it hot. You could put it on top of another pot that's over the fire, that's already been over the fire from before Shabbat, and keep it on there. That's why they have this thing called the kedera blech, right? Yeah. So so they have this thing, the kedera blech. It's kedera, but it goes good. So what it is instead of just a regular flat heating element, you have a strip of water. You fill it with water inside. So right, so it's two levels. Right. So whatever you when you put your pot on there, you're putting your pot on another pot instead of putting your pot on directly over the heating element.
The bottom line is, if there is any temperature differential, the cold gets warm and
Sure. Well, this is talking about hot. This is talking about both are hot.
There's always a difference.
Right, but increasing the heat a little bit is not an issue. Once you're past that threshold of yad soledet bo, there's no worse. We don't say, oh, if it's 140 degrees, it's bad. If it's 150, it's worse. It doesn't matter. Of course.
Heat flows to the cool.
Of course.
That's
Right.
the whole thing, or we just try to use that as a different excuse, to keep the warm water, the cool as a...
Right, but here, in this case, we're talking about where both are hot. So we're just preserving the heat of both. Okay, the bottom one is over the fire. You want to keep the other one hot. You don't want to have another burner going or whatever, so you put it on top of that one. And now you have no problem.
But again, the source of heat is different. But the one
Right, it's going to always heat, right, but that's why they're already hot, so it's okay. So now we say, v'tachit pia babatzek, and you can seal the top of the pot with dough. Because that's how they would make it tightly sealed so it wouldn't lose heat. That's not considered hatmana, because hatmana is only when you cover the whole thing.
Aren't you cooking the dough if you do that?
I guess that's a good question. I guess it must be in a situation either where it won't cook, it's not hot enough to cook it, or maybe it's who knows? It's a good question actually. I didn't think of that. Apparently, it's not hot enough to cook it though. It must be. Not to heat anything, but to preserve the heat. So it says, just like you're not allowed to insulate hot, you're not allowed to insulate cold. That was one opinion, but Rabbi said you can insulate cold, and that's what we follow. And by insulating cold, the Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions. It means you can keep cold things cold, and you can take a cold thing and wrap it in blankets to try to warm it. No problem.
Was the not insulating cold was the only concern that maybe we confuse it with hot, or were there other concerns?
Right, maybe you confuse it with hot, and you would come to cold.
Was that the only concern?
Yeah, that was the only concern. That once you're insulating, now according to the Rambam, it makes a lot of sense. Because according to the Rambam, wrapping something, you're doing the same activity, you're wrapping, according to Rashi and the Rambam, you're wrapping something to control temperature, right, or to adjust temperature. So if you're wrapping it to warm it up, and it's a cold item, we could see why they would have thought, okay, that seems similar to the insulation that we're talking about up till now. According to Rashi, it's a totally different thing. Even wrapping it to chill it was a question, because any wrapping to adjust temperature could lead to a wrapping for heating. Okay?
I mean, you can't chill.
Keeping it
water.
cold, keeping
You
it
can
cold.
Keep it the same temperature.
Right, but that's what Hatmana is about.
You can't.
Because it's not even cold. If it's
Well water is cold.
If it's just below Yatzola bowl, it's hot.
Right, it's warm. Right.
Well, it's warm, so you're keeping it warm.
Wet cloth around it, the evaporation makes it cool.
Yes, you do.
Well,
There you go. Okay, so there you go. So that would be a good example. There, you could actually call it. Okay, so now, ve'en merazkin lo et hasheleg v'lo et habarad. You can't like break up snow or hail b'Shabbat b'shvil sheyazovo memav, so that the liquid will come. Aval notenu l'toch hakos l'toch hakara ve'no choshesh. But you can put ice in your cup or on your plate, and you don't have to worry that it melts. So you're not allowed to break it. Now, there's a machloket about what is the problem with breaking ice or breaking snow. So according to Rashi, the concern is because you're making something new. It's nolad. You're making something new. By making the solid into a liquid, you're creating something new. According to most of the Sephardic Rishonim, there's a different answer, that it's a gezerah, that just like you're extracting liquid, you might extract liquid from fruits, because you're extracting liquid from a solid. And therefore, they would only apply it to situations where the purpose was to drink the water. In other words, where you're crushing it in order to get water because you want to drink it. That would be the problem. So there's very practical application of this to soap, solid soap. Because the reason why the Ramah gets the idea that you can't use solid soap, hard soap on Shabbat, is because you're going from a solid to a liquid, just like breaking the snow, and you're getting liquid from it. Right? So, however, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't subscribe to that idea. The Rambam doesn't subscribe to the idea that you can't use hard soap on Shabbat, because they apply this only to a case where you're crushing to get the liquid you're going to drink, because it's similar to extracting liquid from fruits. And Hadran alach b'met tomnin, we finish b'met tomnin. We're going to go a little bit into the next parak here of b'met behema. So, b'met behema yotza. So, what you need to know about this parak is, just like the Torah tells us we have to rest on Shabbat, it says we have to rest our animals on Shabbat. The primary way if you were not allowed if you were to not allow an animal to graze on Shabbat, because you're not allowed to harvest, so you don't allow it to graze, it's going to starve, right? That's not the animal resting; that's the animal being tortured. So, what do we define as obviously working the animal for our purposes? Having it drag things, carry things, etc., is really the main type of rest we're giving it. So anything, basically the principle is, anything that's on the animal, that's for the purpose of protecting the animal or controlling the animal, is okay. But anything that's the animal's considered carrying is not okay. Similar to a person, any additional thing on you that's not clothing could be carrying. So, what can an animal go out with and what can it not go out with? They're not
even talking about the work that you do. That's
well, for sure, the animal cannot plow for you or anything like that.
But they're not even
talking about that.
So
right now they're going to talk about animal carrying. Right. What is considered a burden of the animal and what's considered something that the animal is being controlled by. So, what can it go out with and what can it not go out with? The camel can go out with an afsar. An afsar was that they would tie around the nose of the camel. They would tie around its face.
Afsar means rain.
Yeah, it's like the rain over its face, right? So it would be over its face. They would tie it around its face. Okay, so that's what it is. So that's the same word. V'na'aka b'chatam. And a na'aka is a female camel. They were a little wilder. They would put a nose ring to control it. Having it over the face wasn't enough. I guess it would get out of that.
What were they controlling?
A nose ring. The camel.
Right.
Female camels are apparently wilder.
So that controlled the camel?
Having the nose ring? Yeah, because it had a chain on it.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
V'luvdikim beprumbia. We're going to see what that is. V'sus basher. And a sus, a horse with just a collar around its neck. V'chol balei asher yotzid basher. And anything that normally is taken with a leash, like a collar and a leash, you can go out with a leash. And an unrelated halacha is that if that collar became tameh met, you could apply the ashes of the para aduma to that collar even when it's on the animal. Okay? Now the Gemara says, "May na'aka b'chatam." What does it mean, na'aka b'chatam? What is this phrase? Amar Rabba bar Chana, na'akta chivarti, a white dromedary, a white female camel, bizmama de parzela, with an iron nose ring, because that's how they would control them. Apparently, they were very wild. Veluvdikim beprumbia. What's a luvdikim beprumbia? Amar Rav Huna, chamara luba bepage de parzela. It means a donkey from Luba, okay, that has a ring of iron. So wait, so what's the difference to Zmama? What is it? How does it translate Zmama versus this one? Because here Rashi is saying also, Zmama is nokevet chotamo, right? Okay, but pageh is something else. Oh, because it's a bit. It goes over the whole face. Okay. In the mouth, right? So that's what it's talking about. So for the female camel, it goes in the nose. For this, it goes in the mouth, right? That's pageh de parzela is it goes in the mouth, the iron thing. So it's even more controlled because it has over the mouth. Yeah. Right, kind of like what they had on Hannibal Lecter or something, you know, like the mask over his face, you know. Okay, so. Okay, so Levi Shadar Zuzay Lebe Chozai. Levi sent money to Bit Chozai lemizban lechamara because he wanted them to buy him a chamara luba, one of these very, very strong donkeys. Tzaru, they wrapped his money. Shadru le sa'are, and they sent him back barley with his money. Lememar, to tell him to nigre the chamara sa'are, that if you want your donkey to be fast, just feed it barley. It'll be you don't need to buy a donkey from some other country in order to get a powerful donkey. Just feed it a better diet, it'll be fast. Amar Rav Yehuda said, Amar Shmuel said, Machlifin lifnei Rabbi Shelzo bazo mahu. They were switching these different things around. In other words, there are several different animals mentioned in the Mishnah, and each one has its specific designated means of control, its restraint. So they were switching them around in front of Rabbi, asking, what if we used, it says a gamal with an afsar. It says a camel with the rope around its face. What if you used that? What if you used a camel with another one of these forms of restraint? So they were switching it around and asking. So, na'akab be'afsar lo tibaylach. Don't ask about a female camel with the rope around her face, because because since it doesn't function, in other words, since you know that just roping her nose, just roping around her face, like the reins, like you said, that's not going to be enough for her. She's too wild. So since it's worthless, she's just carrying it. It's not considered a functional restraint. Okay? But what if you took a gamal, a male camel, who's more docile, and you put a nose ring in him? So he doesn't really need a nose ring. You're doing more than he needs and putting a chain in the nose ring. Do we say that since less is enough for him, it's considered an additional burden? Or maybe additional restraint is not a burden. Maybe a burden is only inefficient restraint, because inefficient restraint is a waste, it's superfluous. Extra restraint is maybe okay.
This is not riding, right? Because you're not allowed to.
No, you're not allowed to ride it. It's to lead it. Only to lead it. You're not allowed to ride. Amar lefanav Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosei. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosei again. So we're talking about Rabbi's yeshiva again. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he's sitting there, and Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosei is there. And remember, Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yosei always quotes his father. So he says, Kach Amar Abba, this is what my dad said. Arba behemot yotzot biafsar hasus ve'apered v'agamal v'chamor. There are 4 animals that can go out with just the rope over their nose, that you don't need to puncture them. What are the 4 things? Hasus, the horse. Ve'apered, the mule. Hagamal, the camel. V'chamor, and the donkey. Lema'ute mai. So what is this coming to exclude? Lav lema'ute gamal b'chatam. Isn't it saying that a gamal, a camel, can only go out with the rope wrapped around his nose? He can't go out with a nose ring chain because that's too much. Too much protection is superfluous and therefore it's carrying. Lo lema'ute naka be'afsar. No, maybe all the reason why Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yosef brought his halacha was not to tell you that too much is bad, but to tell you that too little is bad. To say that a female camel is not controlled by the rope. B'matnitatana, we learned in a Braita, luvdekim vegamal yotzin bafsar, that luvdekim and a gamal can go with the rope wrapped around their nose. Ketanae, and we also had a Tanaitic dispute. En chaya yotza besugar, that a wild animal can't go with just a collar and a leash, sort of thing. Chananya omer yotza besugar. Uvchol davar mishtamer. Chananya says that an animal like that can go out with a collar and a leash, and any other kind of restraint that's good enough to control it. B'may askinan, what are we talking about? Obviously, we can't be talking about a large animal because a large animal just having a leash is not going to be enough. We're talking about a small animal. So certainly a collar will be enough for a small animal. They're arguing about a cat. That one says, since the cat can be controlled by a much thinner type of a rope, right, a much thinner cord, so masoihu, it's considered an additional burden to use a rope, like a thick rope. And according to Chananya, additional protection is not a burden. Masoihu. Amar Ravuna Barchia. Amar Shmuel. Ravuna Barchia said that Shmuel said halacha kechananya, that the halacha follows Chananya, and we'll continue here. We should continue next time here, or you should continue on Shabbat here, because it gets into a whole new story here, moving forward. But the basic machloket here, the discussion is, we understand that less than sufficient is a burden, because it's not functional. Is more than sufficient also considered a burden? In other words, does it have to be perfectly matched? Is the heter, the permission to restrain the animal, is that only for function, only up to the point of function, but no more? Is it quantitative? In other words, once you meet the threshold, quantitatively more is not good? Or is it qualitative? As long as it's functioning, it's good. Too much is also functioning. Too much is still functional. So that's really the machloket in the Gemara. We're going to see that the conversation goes on into the next Amud.